In this other case involving Morris Black, what bearing does it have on this case of Susan Berman's murder, especially when Robert Durst was found not guilty?
Derek, I agree that this is a stretch for the prosecution, especially when they say the motive is Kathleen Durst and the fact that Morris Black was killed after Susan Berman's murder. So, coupled with the acquittal down there in Houston, the prosecution is really kind of stretching itself thin here. They have more than 100 witnesses. This trial is going to go on for 5 months. I know John Lewin has been living with this case, breathing with it for 5 years, more than 5 years, actually 6 years now. He's the one who actually famously conducted the interview of Durst down there in New Orleans in 2015. But I would narrow the scope of this particular witness's testimony. I wouldn't have him talk about Morris Black and all these collateral issues, because you may end up losing your jury here.
Interesting. Rahmani, as well as psychologist Dr. John Delator. Mr. Rahmani, let's talk to you first. In terms of the evidence, various evidence that was collected at the scene, what we're learning is that the medical examiner doesn't really know exactly how Susan Berman was killed, other than that she was shot in the back of the head, right?
One of the state's main themes during prosecution is that Susan Berman was someone who was very safe. She locked her doors. She wouldn't open doors to a stranger. So the person who entered and shot her must have been an acquaintance, someone she knew, someone she voluntarily let in. And I think the defense did a good job on cross-examination, saying that at least the physical evidence, the forensic evidence, is consistent, setting aside the break-in. But in terms of how she was shot, where she was shot, what position she was in when she was shot, is consistent with both a stranger and someone that she knew.
To 2000, right? I mean, that's a long time for recollections, for evidence, and all of that goes into this trial.
Derek, it's not just 2000. We've had witnesses testifying as to what happened in 1982 when Kathleen didn't show up for her medical school rotation. So, this is almost 40 years that we're talking about. And I don't know if 14 months is really going to change things significantly. Really, the issue was it took so long to pick this jury. I mean, there were so many questionnaires, it took weeks of jury selection, and the defense motion for mistrial, three motions for mistrial, actually. This is one of the first cases in LA where I'm from to resume since COVID. So I know why the judge wanted to move this forward, because granting that mistrial would result in even an additional delay.
Right, and we've been looking at pictures, various pictures of Robert Durst in the courtroom, 78 years old, looking frail, having to watch and follow the testimony on a tablet because he's hearing impaired.
Trial is going as we expected. Tough case for the prosecution, cold case, but you have some good facts. Bob Durst lying again and again. The admissions during the jinx, we're going to see that. The jurors are going to see that. We're also going to see all good things. So this is a true sort of Hollywood type case. And, from the defense side, again, what we expected from Dick DeGuerin and what we saw down in Houston with Morris Black, they're going to try to explain away some of Bob Durst's eccentric behaviors. We've already talked about, him having Asperger's and being on the autism spectrum disorder. How he's just a little bit of a quirky guy. And the fact that there really isn't a whole lot of physical evidence, at least, that ties him to the murder of Susan Berman.
A victim not knowing or not having a chance to defend themselves against an attack. How does that weigh into this case?
It weighs into this case because the state is trying to prove that it has to have been someone that Susan Berman knew. This isn't a robbery. I mean, they spent so much time focusing on the fact that her purse was still there, no money was taken, credit cards were still there. And so this is someone that Susan Berman trusted, allowed into her home, and it can only be a finite number of people. And they're trying to narrow that universe down to, obviously, Bob Durst. So key evidence for the state. But again, it doesn't rule everyone out and leaves room for reasonable doubt for the defense.
Neama, as a former federal prosecutor, is this note a smoking gun?
This is critical evidence for the prosecution, and we know it is because they pounded it during their original opening 14 months ago. And again, during the reopening, not just the cadaver letter that was infamously sent to the Beverly Hills Police Department, Beverly being misspelled, but the fact that Bob Durst lied about it so many times. So much of the opening was clip after clip after clip of Robert Durst saying he didn't write the letter and that the person who did had to be involved with the murder. So, of course, the defense has to deal with this. Anyone, you don't have to be a handwriting expert to know that the same person wrote both letters. And there's handwriting samples from the HBO documentary, The Jinx, same block writing, same misspelling of Beverly. So we all know that Bob Durst wrote this letter. So the defense embraced it, and they came up with the story that during opening, at least, that Bob Durst did come to the scene of Susan Berman's murder, panicked like he did with Morris Black, and wrote that letter to let authorities know that she'd been killed, but he didn't have anything to do with the murder. At least that's the argument, and that's what they're hoping the jury believes.
The other holes that the medical examiner is testifying to in this case, does it give a window for defense attorneys, for Robert Durst to say, hey, wait a minute, this case and this evidence doesn't all add up?
Unfortunately, LAPD is notorious for these types of investigations. I love my local law enforcement here, but I mean, you can go back to O.J. Simpson, and the best defense for a defense attorney is a good offense. And what a better offense than saying the LAPD botched another investigation, sloppy detective work. So this was expected, something that the prosecution should have been prepared for.
And what about the time of death here? The estimation, at least, that, they can't exactly nail down when she died, though they're making sort of educated guesses on how long of a time window had passed before she was actually killed to when she was actually found. What do you make of that, Mr. Rahmani?
Well, the longer the delay is, that feeds into the defense theory that Bob Durst happened to walk in there, send the letter, and the only reason that LAPD actually arrived at the scene was a neighbor that reported the door was open. So it fits in within the defense narrative and the defense story that they're trying to sell these jurors. And I wish, going back to my earlier point, the prosecution got out ahead of some of this bad evidence on direct, not wait until redirect after their witnesses got beat up on cross-examination. So, for instance, the first LAPD officers to arrive, they had no idea that they were going to walk into a murder scene. They were just doing a welfare check because the neighbor said the door was open, and this is someone who didn't leave her door open. Those are the types of potentially bad facts that you want to get out in front of. You don't want to be reacting if you're the prosecution. So if I were them, and that every witness, every law enforcement witness is going to be subject to this sloppy investigation allegation, get out ahead of some of those bad facts and explain why the investigation was conducted in the way it was.
He considered a credible witness. I mean, there's some talk about her not reading the full Miranda rights to Rivera at the time of his arrest, and that is creating problems, right, for his confession.
No question, Derek. This is a key witness for the prosecution, as well as the defense. So it's going to go in two different directions. The prosecution is arguing that this was all inevitable discovery. So even though there were problems with the Miranda warnings and problems with Rivera's confession, that because he voluntarily agreed to the search of his vehicle where blood was found and ultimately the DNA matched Mollie Tibbetts, that law enforcement would have found the body inevitably. And one of the primary arguments they have is that the body wasn't buried, it was in a cornfield. So it's just a matter of time before they found it. The defense is arguing that this was not inevitable. They would not have found the body. And this is all what we call fruit of the poisonous tree. Because the confession was tainted, all the evidence related thereto that came after should similarly be tainted and suppressed. So these are all issues that are going to be argued on appeal. For now, for our purposes in this trial, the confession after the second correct Miranda warning is coming in. The body in the cornfield is coming in. The blood in the trunk, everything is coming in. But this will all be relitigated up through the Iowa Courts of Appeal. That's why this witness is so critical to not just this case, to the inevitable appeal.
Right, but as you mentioned, this is really a lot of evidence that is piling up against Rivera, right? I mean, blood in the car, the surveillance video of the car, kind of following Mollie Tibbetts around, the confessions as well. All of this really adding up and pointing to Rivera as the murderer here.
Oh, I agree. I think he's going to be convicted by this almost all-white jury out there in Iowa. He's an undocumented Mexican citizen. A lot of evidence that at least has been admitted in this trial, right? He's stalking her. There's video. There's these admissions where, he had an argument and he got upset and he blacked out. I mean, he literally takes law enforcement to the precise spot in the cornfield where her body is disposed of. The blood in the vehicle. So he will be convicted by this jury. There's no doubt in my mind, and it will be a quick conviction. What the defense is trying to do is plan on relitigating these issues that have already been litigated in the trial court up through the appellate court.
And we should mention, though, this trial had a little bit of political implications, right? Former President Trump brought this case up as an example of why immigration reform during his presidency needed to happen, because there was this danger of immigrants, in the case of this man, a Mexican national, coming into the U.S. and committing crimes.
Yes, not just the former president, but the Iowa governor got involved in this case. And that's one of the reasons it had to be moved to a county 100 miles away. But still, again, a very different political makeup out there in Iowa, jury makeup. It's going to be hard for this particular defendant to get much sympathy over there, given the highly politicized nature of this murder, the fact that, elected officials at the highest level are talking about this case.
Right. State of Iowa versus Cristhian Rivera in the murder of 20-year-old University of Iowa college student Mollie Tibbetts. A lot of evidence really stacking up against Rivera.